Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone to our Heroes and Villains in the Anthropocene series, and especially warm welcome to today's speaker, Olivia Angé from the Free University of Brussels, where she is currently assistant professor and the principal investigator of the ERC starting grant Flourishing Seeds. Olivia specializes in the study of economic exchanges, agriculture, and prosperity in the Andes. And since 2014, she has been doing research on potato agrobiodiversity in Peru. She has also performed extensive fieldwork on barter fairs in the Argentinian Cordillera and is the author of Barter and Social Regeneration in the Argentinian Andes and co-editor of Ecological Nostalgias and Anthropology and Nostalgia. And for your information, Olivia's presentation will be recorded and made available on our website, where you can also find the recording of Columba's paper from last time. Now let me hand over to Olivia, who will be speaking about On Parasites and Commensals, Stories of Ambivalent Potato Companionship Across Anthropocene Spaces and Times.
Thank you very much, Viola, for your introduction. And I also want to thank warmly Hannah and Lena for the invitation and giving me the possibility to share my work with you. Today, as you've said, Viola, I've started in 2015 a research into human potato relatedness in the Peruvian Andes, especially in the context of agrobiodiversity conservation project. So part of this paper will relate to that fieldwork, but there are other parts that deal with situation and ethnographic context that I'm probably less familiar with. So this, the presentation I have today is very much a work in progress, and I will be very pleased to have the opportunity to discuss this after my talk and receive your comments. I have quite a lot to tell you, so I will just read my presentation to make sure that I fit with the schedule. So I apologize if I get boring at some time, but I think this will be more convenient. So I will be talking on Parasites and Commensals, as Viola said, stories of ambivalent potato companionships across Anthropocene space and time. Historian Rebecca Earls concludes her recent volume on the politics of the potato by challenging the glorification of potato heroes, such as Antoine Parmentier. A 18th century agronomist, he rests along with national idols at the Père Lachaise cemetery, surrounded with potato offering deposited by visitors. As stated on the Boulevard Parmentier memorial sign, the agronomist is praised for having introduced potato in French plots and kitchens. European history features myriads of such potato champions credited for fostering national grandeur by feeding its people. Earl's work, however, demonstrates the role of anonymous peasants in the propagation of the potato across Europe and beyond. This presentation furthers her exploration of potato heroes by turning attention to outstanding characters in the tuberous population. While many times disqualified as a humble or bare crop, potato has been acknowledged to have changed the world history, to use a famous phrase by historian William McNeill. In potato scholarship, we meet potato as alternately a savior or a hopeless victim, a blessing or a curse, a delight or a tasteless staple. In his classic volume on the history of social influence of the potato, eminent potato breeder and botanist Radcliffe Salomon vividly encapsulated these sharply contrasted appreciations by remarking that the potato plays, I quote him, a twofold part: that of a nutritious food and that of a weapon ready fought for the exploitation of a weaker group in a mixed society. More recently, James Scott offered an alternative perspective by looking at potato as the staple crop of subversive communities evading state subjugation. This presentation explores these sharp ambivalences for shedding light on the making of heroes and villains in the Anthropocene. On this purpose, I will introduce stories of potato-human companionship in 4 disparate ecological and historical settings. In the vein of David Nelly and Jerry Kern's approach of potato affordances, I point out the materialities and morphological capabilities which have enabled Solanum historical prominence. Yet, in the whole, the stories reveal that potato heroism always emerged in relation, with increased volatility when enmeshed in humans' political projects. To explore contrasted regimes of potato esteem, I will extend scholarship in the anthropology of ethics to explore the possibilities of plants becoming exemplary. I take on Joel Robbins' understanding of exemplars as, I quote him, ontological home for values, to jointly consider heroes and villains as influent ethical subjects incarnating values with positive or negative valence, respectively. Thereby, these transhistorical vignettes of tuberous heroism and villainy revisit recent scholarship about the creation of moral examples in light of a multi-species ethnography. So the first story is about potato societies in the Andean highlands. Dating back from the 1st century, outstanding pottery by Moche crafters provides the oldest representation of potato as the hero of an Andean civilization. Featuring humans and animals sprouting from potato eyes, they suggest a tuberous origin of earthly beings. Potato-human interdependence has also been translated into myth, acknowledging potato flourishing as a key feature in the emergence of human societies. In his aforementioned opus, Redcliffe Selleman advances the idea that potato use was a prerequisite for Amazonian people being able to move from the rainforest and establish settlements in the Andean highlands. Thanks to its resistance to extreme and highly variable climates, the potato was vital to sustain centers of human population in the highlands where cereals could not grow. According to archaeological records, hunter-gatherers started domesticating Solanum tubers between 8000 and 5000 BC around the Titicaca Lake at some 4,000 meters above sea level. The first evidences of cultivation feature bitter Solanum stenotonum, which consumption requires a complex freeze-dry processing to eliminate poisonous glycoalkaloids harmful to human bodies. Bitter varieties are now only cultivated in some parts of the Central Andes, where they are appreciated for being highly resistant to frost and disease. Most varieties cultivated throughout the Cordillera pertain to another Solanum species, the Tuberosum indigenum, evidencing a huge gamut of varieties differing in their morphological and physiological features. Indigenum allowed for a rich diet in the Andean highlands, not only providing a rich, stable food, but also a remedy that saved human life from an array of disease. While Indigenum provides bigger tubers and greater plasticity, it is much less resistant to frost and blight than Stenotonum, and therefore dependent on human care to thrive in most Andean ecological niches. Positing potato consumption as a condition for the flourishing of human collectives in the Cordillera, as well as human care for potato flourishing, these are narratives of potato and human becoming companion species, which in the sense of Donna Haraway means that they develop with each other a relation of care and usefulness. Haraway invokes etymology to help us grasping the state of her concept. Companies are those who share bread and work together. Hence, our companions feature the multiple beings of all size and shape whose lives are entangled to our composite self, both within and outside our body. In the long Andean history, potato and human have been commensals. They gathered in fields and around tables, being both nurtured through their encounter. These companies allowed for the composition of complex societies in the Andean highlands. While maize was Inca's most venerated crop, tubers were nonetheless vital to the imperialist project. Transformed into chunio through freeze-dry processing, the potatoes supplied state storehouse throughout the territory, feeding administrators, soldiers, and state workers, as well as the population at large in case of bad harvest. In dried form, potato could be stored for years, and its lightness eases transport wherever armies needed to be fed. In the peculiar ecology of the Andean highlands, potato thus served as a state crop in the sense of James Scott, suitable for food storage and tax collection, as cereals usually are. Tales about the origin of the highland potato growing point out another dimension of their political prowess. They highlight underground life as a crucial tuberous asset, providing vital defense against invaders. Fearing to die of starvation under lowlanders' pressure, the story goes, highlanders petitioned for God's protection. Divinities sent them unknown seed, which once sown brought out beautiful plants with impressive fruits and flowers. These were looted by invaders who mistook them for a plentiful harvest. Desperately starving, highlanders turned again to their gods, who suggested they dig the ground to discover their blessing. This is a widespread story that I've heard declined in a new version accounting for resistance strategies against European colonizers. The second story is about the propagation of feeding potatoes in European gardens. Though much less celebrated than gold, the potato compost Spaniards loot after the invasion of South America. The tuber's arrival in European soils thus unmeshed in the violent history of European colonization. After its 16th century journey within shitholes, the potato presence in Europe has remained discreet for a few centuries, thriving in the underground of cottage gardens across the continent. Hidden underground, potato production evaded tithe collecting. Here again, the underground life of the potato was a key quality raising human interest for knitting tuberous companionship. The well-established story of potato being dismissed by peasants for being a navel subterranean root lacking biblical approval has been recently refuted by historians who have produced evidence of early potato cultivation in peasant garden. In fact, fieldwork and ingenious experiment by peasants in their family garden has been necessary to facilitate the Andean crop adaptation to its new habitats. Once acclimatized, potato produced more food per surface and water supply than previously grown cereals, proving to be a prolific commensal indeed. As argued by Earle, it is only in the 18th century that the potato received elite consideration, when food habits started to be used as strategic technologies of statecraft. The promotion of crop that would improve population health and well-being became a patriotic endeavor, and potatoes stood out as the darling of food political economists. Statesmen and intellectuals who promoted potato and pretended to facilitate their acceptation by peasants after centuries of supposed stubborn rejections emerged as national heroes. Frédéric de Greet and Antoine Parmentier star in school books, museum, and even academic literature, lauded for having introduced the prolific tuber to the German and French masses, respectively. They preach for potato eating and growing as an avenue toward the raise of stout and fertile populations, regarded as the source of a powerful and prosperous nation. Their campaign built on a ubiquitous potato enthusiasm broadcast in press and treaties by philosophers, physicians, economists, and priests, championing the many potato virtues. The tuber was lauded for producing prolific yields with straightforward growing on soils of unequal fertility, as well as for its outstanding nutritive qualities due to high content in protein, calcium, and vitamin C. Not a mere feeding resource, potato was promoted for the gustatory pleasure it aroused to humans, and therefore extolled as a conveyor of poor workers' happiness. As Adam Smith put it, the strongest man and most beautiful woman of his nation lived on potato. In the preach of potato advocates, the Irish poor incarnated the flourishing population of potato eaters. With the plentiful potato grown on their restricted plots, destitute Irish peasants were producing large families of hearty people. Plentiful commensals, potato and human mutually nurtured each other's, multiplying their respective population across the country. Potato critics multiplied in the 19th century, declaring that potato was in fact reproducing a poorly productive population, useless for the emergent modern state. The marvelous tuber was now accused of being so prolific to incentivize poor people laziness by facilitating a wretched livelihood with minor effort. They warned that potato would threaten their labor force monopolization at the service of growing industries. Accused of abusing from the potato bounty for their own reproduction, Irish potato eaters were then depicted as parasites to the emerging capitalist nation. It is noteworthy that in the discourse of both advocates and detractors, potato was held to produce specific kinds of people, either virtuous or perverted. Be it as it may, the 18th century potato opulence in Northern Europe produced a demographic boom, releasing workers from rural fields to urban industries. Yet, after decades of prolific feeding, invasion by the fungus-like mold Phytophthora infestans induced a widespread late black ruining harvest for 3 consecutive years from 1845 to 1848. Parasitized by Phytophthora, potato features the tragic Irish famine episode as the tuberous villain. The pest affected fields across Europe, but nowhere was the situation as devastating as in Ireland. Tuberosum had been so prolific that fields were devoted to monoculture, opening up the possibility of an overwhelming spread of the late blight. The potato extinction in Irish plots provoked the death of millions of people and a massive movement of immigration, mostly to the United States, where human population was reshaped by the Irish potato exhaustion. Hosting Phytophthora infestans, the wonderful crop turned into an agricultural villain, producing historical upheavals. The calamity induced the development of new experiments and breeding technologies for producing new varieties able to withstand the threatening pests. Yet, the late blight continues to feature stories of modern agriculture as a core enemy to potato flourishing, able to invade certain kinds of potato fields 100 times faster than other bacterium or virus, as some declares. I will come back to the Phytophthora plague in the last story, but now I would like to talk about in situ conservation and the native potato rescue in the Andes. While potato was becoming the darling of European Enlightenment menu, in its Andean homeland, the tuber was despised by the mestizo elite. Potato livelihood was posited as an index of highland indigenous backwardness, through racist tropes still circulating to date. In this vein, campaigns by governmental and non-governmental institutions since the second half of the past century have intended to lead purportedly unproductive cultivators toward progress. Their intervention entailed the wide distribution of laboratory-produced papas mejoradas, or improved varieties in Spanish, along with chemical packages necessary for growing these high-yielding tubers. In 1974, the national potato explorer and botanist Carlos Ochoa famously produced the Revolucion variety by cross-pollination between Tuberosum tuberosum and Tuberosum indigenum. This variety loomed large in the agricultural modernization policies, extending its father's fame as it covered cultivated fields across the country. This appraisal contrasts with agroecological partakers who joined voices at the beginning of the 20th century to denounce the damages caused by these high-yielding varieties, provoking soil exhaustion, chemical contamination, and agrobiodiversity loss. Fears of potato genetic diversity loss induced a turn in conservation policies toward in situ initiatives meant to preserve agrobiodiversity in the fields as a complement to ex situ saving in gene banks. One such initiative is the world-famous Parque de la Papa, Potato Park in Spanish, which was founded in 2002 by 5 peasant communities in the highland of Cusco, supported by the local NGO Andes. To achieve the park's conservation goals, an investigation center, a greenhouse, a museum, a potato-focused restaurant, and a storage room were built in each of the park's different communities. Communal land was allotted to the experimental culture of a range of varieties, mostly from the indigenous species, by a team of 8 peasants acting as local technicians. In this experiment and other, technicians collaborate with the Lima-based CIP, Spanish acronym for International Center of the Potato. Present in more than 30 countries, CIP presents itself as dedicated to reducing poverty, enhancing food and nutrition security, and improving natural resources and ecosystem services. The park's technicians travel the world to promote agrobiodiversity conservation in international congress and peasants' congregations. Having talked at myriads of congress and meetings, including the COPs in Paris and Lima, 50-year-old potato grower Lino Mamani is one such potato steward of great charisma. His potato expertise is huge indeed, as he came to grow about 200 different varieties in his domestic plots. The park is currently curating more than 1,300 varieties of papas nativas, native potato in Spanish, including 400 repatriated from the seed bank. It is internationally appraised as one of the most successful in situ conservation initiatives. Yet, the purpose of the park extends beyond this quantitative success. Its partakers work to raise potato esteem at different scales. Addressing respeto, or respect in Spanish, is a key concern of many peasants in this region who derive about 70% of their daily calorie intake from their potato. Those who continue to enact their potato respect in daily and ritual practices explained to me that this was a condition for potato flourishing in their fields. My host in the community of Amaru warned me, "You must respect potato really, really well. If you give her bad treatment, it will necessarily disappear progressively. Year after year, fewer and fewer harvests, then it's gone. You must care for them with affection." When addressing respect to their potato, growers treat them as beings able to receive human esteem and able to respond to lack of respect by stopping their growing process. The Papawatai ceremony, welcoming newly harvested potato before they are stored in the larder, is a highlight of respeto enactment. Meaning potato tying in Quechua, the Papawatai is a domestic gathering intended to fasten tuberous body and spirit together. It practically consists of coating piles of potato with straw and coiling llama wool rope around the heap. The potato spirit is then attracted with the smoke of burning guinea pig grease and incense to bring it back from the fields where it might have stayed. Afterwards, the harvest is sprinkled with wine or maize beer and covered with flowers or confettis. Wearing their ponchos as formal attire, the land-owning couples share their tubers with their favorite delight to express their esteem for their life-sustaining companions. Beside the promotion of such domestic ceremony that today's cultivators tend to omit, members of the park venture to realize Papawatai in public scenes as a plea for respectful agricultural practices. In 2004, one such ceremony was performed during a meeting at the National Council for the Environment in Lima, when a delegation from the park successfully lobbied the government to declare a National Day of the Potato. Every 13th of May, the tuber has been nationally celebrated ever since. The enthusiasm was such that the president at that time, Alejandro Toledo, subsequently petitioned the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN to declare an International Year of the Potato, which was accomplished in 2008. While not all of these potato events did in fact support the kind of agriculture the park delegation was reclaiming, the UN declaration nonetheless epitomized a shift in the global potato appraisal, positing it as the flagship crop to achieve international food security targets. Potato rituals have served agricultural reclaim in other contexts as well, before depositing potato seeds in Svalbard's vaults, before renewing the park's collaboration contract with the SIP, or when fighting against the introduction of genetically modified tubers in the country. On these national and international political spheres, such interspecies encounters feature the potato with a subjectivity of its own, deserving to be treated with respect. And now I will tell you my last story about genetic engineering and the hyper-resistant potato in East Africa. Once established in Europe, the potato continued its journey toward new continents where human care supported its adaptation to an impressive array of ecological milieu. In their imperialist venture, European colonizers congratulated themselves for bringing the potato as an opportunity to overcome local poverty and backwardness. As noted by Hurl, potato campaigns in the colonies were sustained by, I quote her, a highly ideological narrative of disinterested European philanthropy. Settlers promoted the tuber as a European crop, which adoption by local was evaluated as an index of their advance towards civilization. At present, Tuberosum has become a feeding champion consumed daily by 1 billion people. It is the fourth staple in human diet following wheat, corn, and rice. This worldwide success is the result of Tuberosum's outstanding propagating capacities. Producing more calories than any other crops with the same land and water, it is a merit highly valued by cultivators at all scales, from the agro-industry to small peasants. It is also coveted by breeders, agronomists, and food policymakers as a crucial ally to reach food security in times of ecological erosion and demographic boom. Notwithstanding potato extraordinary feeding virtues, laboratory breeders continue their search toward more efficient varieties. A core line of experiments with the potato gene pool aims at engineering new varieties with greater resistance to insect, fungi, bacteria, and virus. Among these, Phytophthora infestans remains a major enemy, hence a core target of breeders' experiments. In this vein, a new kind of potato has been produced by a consortium of potato magnates from the UK and the US in collaboration with the SIP. They created a cisgenic crop by transferring 3 late blight-resistant genes from Mexican and Argentinian potato wild relative to the Victoria Tuberosum variety. The above-mentioned consortium is now striving to release the new variety on the Ugandan markets, advertising it as a solution against hunger in this region, registering high levels of rural poverty. Claiming that its complete resistance to late blight will, I quote, reduce costs associated with potato production, the losses caused by the disease, and farmers' exposure to harmful chemicals, the SIP brings out its cisgenic product as a food security hero. This enthusiasm is echoed by Associated Press articles declaring the Earthtree Victoria an opportunity to grow more food, I quote again, to grow more food on less land while safeguarding the environment, therefore protecting millions of its citizens from going hungry. Besides Phytophthora presence, another reason why experimental cultivation of cisgenic Victoria has been based in East Africa is the region's loose legislation on GMO, offering therefore promising prospect for distributing a potato that would be banished elsewhere, in particular in the home countries of its genitors, including the SIP headquarters. Attempts by the Peruvian government to introduce GMO potato on national market in 2011 were hampered by intense peasant mobilization. That year, cultivators from the potato park traveled to Lima to reclaim potato respect. Their struggle resumed in March 2020 when SIP announced intention to market Earthtree Victoria in Uganda. As a response, Andes published an information paper refuting SIP's appraisal of cisgenic potato as food security hero, against the charitable discourse by Earthtree Victoria creators who claim to save African farmers from poverty. Andes argues that, I quote, genetically modified potatoes may prove lucrative for US and British billionaire investors, but are bad news for indigenous people and small farmers in Africa and the Andes. They denounce biopiracy by laboratory breeders who use digital sequencing information to avoid benefit sharing with the original cultivator in the Andean Center of Biodiversity. Andes staff wonder why is SIP incentivizing the labor-intensive cultivation of native tuber cornucopia in the highland plots, while supporting the free exploitation of the potato genetic information by agribusiness barons, as they call them. This timely controversy invites us to ask whose hero is the GMO potato intended to become? Will A3 Victoria be parasite or commensal when hosted in East African households? And now to finalize, I have some tentative conclusive remarks. The stories I've introduced feature the potato as ambivalent exemplars. As concrete realizations of value, the potato alternately encapsulate happiness and misery, strength and vulnerability, contamination and regeneration, life flourishing and deadly devastation. To examine how such contrasted tuberous exemplars are created requires breaking the potato category apart, nor is the usual species divide useful for that purpose. Diving beyond botanical categories open up avenues to meet with chunyo, a state tuber that can be stored for decades and transported easily, while cumbersome watery Tuberosum decay within months. To meet with the papas mejoradas and other high-yielding Tuberosum heavy chemical consumers, provoking soil erosion, while native potatoes burn under pesticide application. GM tubers eloquently cross-cut species divides. While these broad categories used in the struggle against biopiracy and genetic technologies, it is purposely avoided by laboratory breeders who opt for alternative names, like so-called innate potato, hopefully more acceptable by reluctant consumers. Clearly, this vernacular potato nomenclature encapsulates contrasted biological capabilities. Still, the potato stories in this presentation outline interspecies entanglements that bring out a given solanum morphology into a grace or a curse in a particular socio-historical locus. Harvey's elaboration on companion species is particularly revealing on this regard because she insists on the ongoing performativity of interspecies relatedness, continuously shaping the partner's existence in the world. Enmeshed in process of co-evolution, human and tubers indeed developed new bodily capabilities in their encounters, creating also new ethical subjectivities. Looking at the creation of potato exemplars, bring out the instability of their valence in social life. Stars of the Peruvian national agriculture, papas mejoradas, are the villain of agroecologists. Historically vilified as index of indigenous wretchedness, native potatoes are now praised as food security hero by international institutions. Celebrated by breeding laboratories as allies in the war against poverty, GM tubers are repudiated by peasants, ecological activists, and the civil society at large. One's hero is thus another's villain. In this tournament of value, to use the Appadurai's formula, it is not only the potato valence that is contested, it also is the virtue of the human breeders, growers, and consumers. Inspired by the stories of potato-human collaborations, I propose to bring out the figure of commensal and parasites as contrasting figures of companionship that enlightens shifting positioning in the politics of multispecies appraisal. In the Plantationocene era of soil exhaustion, climatic unpredictability, and agricultural failures, these contrastive figures emerge as generic villains and heroes whose incarnations are shifting according to the cosmopolitical encounters in which they participate. While existing literature in the anthropology of ethics has largely focused on the good exemplars, this tuberous exploration, inspired by the broader theme of the hero and villain seminar, urges to consider the entangled creation of positive and negative characters. It thereby supports a more general plea developed by Corina Howland to engage with bad ethics as more than the negative equivalent of the goods. In this vein, interspecies studies of heroism and villainy point to the heuristic merits of embracing the good and the bad in our exploration of ecological ethics. This perspective, I hope potato stories have shown, shed unique light on the politics of more than human heroism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. That was really, really fascinating and insightful. These 4 different scenes of human potato companionship. While people think, to give people a bit time to think, develop a question, maybe I might ask a question first. And I was wondering, you suggest the parasites and commensals as sort of figures of villainy and heroism, and maybe to think through agriculture in the Anthropocene. So I was wondering what sort of other agricultural crops maybe could occupy these figures, whether you have some examples for this.
I must say that this part of the paper is the more tentative one that I've introduced, but I wanted to enjoy having the opportunity for collective discussion to throw it in the debate. So even I think for the potato people relationship, I would still be curious to discuss it. And now if I want to extend it to other crops, I guess if you think through rice growing, you could also see emerge that kind of figure with the golden rice, which has raised a lot of research in laboratories and was really acclaimed as so promising for human population, and then was part of this green revolution that completely reshaped ecologies in Asia. So I think that would be another example, but I'm sure that if you look at maize, there will also be you will also see that kind of figure emerging. I was thinking particularly in those kind of GMO that cannot reproduce themselves anymore and that oblige peasants to go to the market to buy their seed, because this is the kind of parasites that completely lose their reproductive capacities and become dependent of their human hosts to reproduce themselves. And there is this huge controversy around the introduction of GMO maize in Mexico, because this is the center of domestication there. So that would be another kind of example. And then maybe a last one would be weeds and the, how do you say it in English, the soft wheat that is used to make breads, and which was the biggest commensal, I think, in European history, as people have been eating bread for centuries, and now we are many European people are trying to escape that kind of wheat because of the gluten and all these allergies that are generated because we've been experimenting with these wheats so much to have the perfect wheat, extremely productive and so wonderfully useful by bakery makers, that we've come to produce specific kind of wheats that are toxic for human bodies. So I think, yes, studies would need to be, I think, carried out for every crop, and I cannot pretend to know all of them, nor do I pretend to have really experimented with the concept of parasites enough to announce a firm introduction of this idea, but it was really a point for discussion.
Okay, thank you. So anyone who has got a question, please raise your hand.
I could nip in if no one else has a question yet, maybe. Yeah, thank you, Olivia. That was super, super interesting. And I love the term, I think, was it potato studies or potato scholarship? Brilliant. I love the idea. But yeah, that was so fascinating because I just learned so much from that. I thought what you gave us was a really interesting kind of discussion of these ambivalent companionships between potatoes and humans. But I guess my question is sort of the other side of Viola's question, which is, I'm just wondering about what other relations, what other non-human entities or agencies we can see coming into play here. So it's not just about the potato relating to humans, it's also about the potato and soil, or it's about, you know, certain chemicals or certain climates, and various other sort of elements of the environment. And I was just wondering where we might go with that as well. You know, do these kind of get encompassed by these two figures of commensals and parasites, or are there other ways of conceiving their relationship to the potato, right? So how do you kind of broaden this exploration beyond just potatoes and humans as a sort of interspecies relationship to other species or other entities that might come into play as well?
Yeah, I think that the one that I explored more while preparing the paper was the Phytophthora infestans, because it's been so famous in history for having produced the Irish potato famine, and because it is also described as a parasite by biologists and recognized as such. And vilified, and that's why I also wanted to bring the East African history, because then you see how these parasites justified kind of politics of agricultural politics and experimentation that are also extremely polemical. But I'm sure that other parasites would, or other pests at least, would need to be explored, because there are potato enemies in the fields that are very much famous, and that agriculture are fighting against constantly, with specificities in every continent and ecological settings. The diophore here in Europe is famous for that, because it clearly destroys harvests recurrently. And it's the gorgojo de los Andes. It's another one that is terrific for Andean growers, because they can lose significant part of their harvests when there are invasions. But I would have to study the kind of biological relationship that exists between them, and see how far there are parasites, or if it's just only us that look at them as parasites because we lose our foods. And this is where I cannot answer. I can answer for the Phytophthora, because I've been focusing on that for the presentation, but I would have to have closer look, I think, for other kind of pests. And also climatic phenomenon would also probably enter that kind of categories, although from our naturalist education, it's more complicated to capture them as characters in themselves, or entities, but that would meet very beautifully Andean perspective, because they look at the rain as an entity of its own, with intentionalities and moralities of its own. So I would have to decenter myself and have a closer look at that kind of potential commensal or parasites as well. But clearly, Andean peasants, they eat with the earth, and they sit at table with earth. For instance, when they eat these potatoes that are baked underground, making oven in the plots at the harvest time, this is a way of sharing the harvest with the earth, and please the earth with all the smells of roasted potato that are cooking the ground. So there, the earth and human and the potato are commensal all together. Maybe sometimes they can be parasitized as well by new phenomena. But I would have to think further through it to extend the multi-species assemblage that gather in different kind of contexts.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a question from Jan.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, yeah, Olivia, you basically already answered my question mostly by the response to the last question about trying to, like, in the relationship between the potato and the human, first to expand to multiple entities, and then to try to go beyond the kind of agrobiodiversity technocratic model of like human environment interaction, if you will. And one thing I picked up is like how you use vernacular nomenclature, which is fascinating, and the idea of going beyond botanical species. But you also mentioned spirit entities. So that makes me question, like, what are the two, if you even restricting it to like humans and potatoes, what is the potato actually? Like, is it just this tuber, or like, can you really speak of the relationship between the tuber and the people, if you know what I mean? There's the material aspect of it, but yeah, I guess unpacking like what a potato is in different situations could be yeah, interesting in that way. And that, yeah, translates to agency as well. Like, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yes, in the conclusion, yeah, I suggested that to explore the potato agency, we have to break that category apart, because indeed it's used in a very, very broad sense. And if you read most literature, is the category that always emerge, unless you read like ethnobotanical accounts or botanists. But in social sciences, historians, geographers, anthropologists, they always talk about potato, and I guess they mostly refer to one species of potato, which is Solanum tuberosum, and mostly Solanum tuberosum. But in fact, Chunio, for instance, it's not that species, it's another one. And if you look at transgenic potatoes, they also mix different kind of species together. So we would need to have different kinds of categories. Even papas mejoradas, or these high-yielding varieties, they mix together and they cross-cut all these categories. And I think that wondering what the potato is, it depends from the perspective. So maybe I can explain what a potato is for myself, or as an anthropologist, I've devoted much energy to understand what is the potato for the Andean growers I'm working with. And this is clearly something very different, because I learned with them that potato can have a spirit, but the spirit is a very complex entity that isn't always hosted within one little potato body. And all these things have to be mapped to understand what the potato agency can be. But clearly, the peasant I work with have different kinds of categories and different ways of identifying the potato, and even the papas mejoradas are questioned to have a spirit or not, or if they do, most of the peasants, they say that they do have this spirit. It's called animo in Spanish. They say that they do have one because they grow, but they some explain that their kind of animo is different from the animo of native potatoes. And interestingly, these native potatoes, they include Stenotemum species and Tuberosum species. So this is native potato is also a category that doesn't fit very well with the botanic categories. So there is, I think your question is huge and wide, and there is a whole work to be done to understand vernacular categories and how they relate to different kind of agricultural practices and ecological ethics.
Can I just comment for a second? Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And as an ethnobotanist, I look at taxonomies of like different useful plants, right? So you have, yeah, but the question is then how to connect them, like again, to these worldviews. But I think it's an important decentering exercise in the Anthropocene, like to go beyond the human perspective, yeah, by incorporating different worldviews. Yeah, great.
Yeah, and I think the topics of the seminar is very useful for thinking through that, because these categories of villainy and heroism are so shifting that it raises questions of ethics, ecological ethics, and it helps to understand how the people who are in contact with the potatoes in fact consider them.
There's a question in the chat. So Kristen Terry says, thanks for the presentation. I worked in the potato park with Andy's NGO in 2012. Peasants at that time were concerned about climate change negative effects on their native potatoes. Did you find this kind of narrative in East Africa? Do you think that climate change can be seen as a sort of parasite in our Anthropocene era? So 2 questions.
Yeah, I think we are back here to the exchange I've just had with Liana when I was wondering if I could understand rain as a parasite, or winds as parasites, or temperature as parasite, and I must acknowledge that this is difficult for me to consider that temperature can be a being, or winds can be a being, but I've heard in particular with the rain, the sun, that the people, the Andean growers, they do understand these meteorological phenomena as having, being entities of their own, with an agency and emotional reaction. So I would really have to consider that more closely. Clearly the sun and the rain, they are personified and they are imbued with subjectivity. Now I don't know East Africa, so I wouldn't be able to explain or to say anything about how climate change is perceived then by these cultivators, and I don't know how they are affected by climate change. And the situation certainly is different in Ugandan context in the plain than in the highlands of the Andes, because the highlands, the Andean highlands, is famous for being particularly affected by climate change due to its situation. The climate change is really perceptible there at the different scale of this tropical mountain. So the Andes is acknowledged by climatologists to be really a center where you can perceive very clearly climate change effect already now. And I don't know how far this is the case in East Africa. And so the first part of the question was if I can say that in East Africa the cultivators are also affected by climate change. So this is something I cannot reply because I'm not an East Africanist. I've never been there. And yes, I think I have replied to both parts of the question.
Okay. And then there's another question from Claudia Campisano. I was wondering if you also came across hybrid crops and what kinds of reactions and feelings these gave rise to compared to GMOs. These gave rise to compared.
Hybrid crops against GMO.
Yeah.
Yes, hybrid crops are widespread in the Andes, particularly in the lowlands. because their indigenous tubers cannot be grown easily. They really pertain to the highest ecological level of the Andes. But even in the highest lands, there have been campaigns of introduction of improved varieties, and there is a whole mix of so-called native varieties that have been improved. And so you have, this is not really a contrasted category that you say you have the native on one side and the improved on another side, because in the field things are still more complicated by the fact that some native varieties have been commercialized so widely that they have been improved in laboratories, but through cross-pollination processes. So hybrid crops are present even in the highland, and some peasants have started to cultivate them because they grow more quickly. So they can just only cultivate them near their house where they have irrigation infrastructure, not in the highest lands, but they are part of the highland where it's possible to grow hybrid crop and hybrid potato if you want to use also chemical packages to make sure that they won't be destroyed by pests and that they will grow properly. So I've crossed a lot of hybrid crop in the communities I've been working in the potato park indeed, and I think an important part of the potato park campaign initially was also to deal with the growing use of these kind of hybrid crops and to restore the cultivation of native potatoes. But these are also ethical conversation and polemics that are going on in the very communities themselves, because not all growers do have the same ecological ethics in their fields, and they have particular use specific to each household. Now, GMO, I haven't crossed on my fieldwork because they are prohibited in Peru, as I said, and peasants have been fighting a lot against that. In fact, GMO potatoes have been only accepted in very few countries where they were not used for human consumption, but for industries, where the starch was using in other kind of industries, and even in the US, where some hybrid crops have been introduced, they have been very, very polemical. Even McDonald's has refused to use them, to tell you how controversial they are. And as I said, if they are now doing all these experiments in East Africa, it's because this is a place where the legislation is still very obscure and there are opportunities to do that. But in Peru, I wouldn't crop a GMO potato because they've been rejected. And it's even interesting how maybe you can cross the GMO as a phantom, how you say that, a ghost, even, because it's there all the time in discourses. And the people, they live with the GMO as a threat. And when the SIP announced that they would release the GMO in East Africa, then Andes was there ready to fight and to mobilize itself. And so it's always in the horizon as a shade against papas nativas, even though now it's prohibited and there are no GMO in Peru. And it's the same for maize GMO in Mexico. Apparently, this is something I've read in Hartigan Care for the Species book, because he was surprised to realize how much peasants will talk about GMO maize in comparison to the very materialization of GMO presence in peasants' fields. And so I think GMO also exists as an entity, like maybe as a monster that we talk about a lot, but we kind of rarely meet it materially.
Okay, thanks. There's one comment from Jan who said he has to leave soon, right? But maybe I can read it out. in biology, ecological interactions are categorized in a particular way, and then he's referring to a page. For instance, commensalism benefits one organism and the other organism is neither benefit nor harmed. So he says that commensal is not the opposite of parasite in this sense.
Yes, I would certainly have to dive more into biological literature on parasitism to understand what the concept covers in this discipline. So this is, as I said, really the tentative part of the paper. But what I wanted to highlight is that in commensal gathering, all the partakers are nurtured and they can reproduce themselves, while when you have a gathering between a host and a parasite, there is one part that is going to find some benefits at the expense of the other. So maybe the two concepts are not entirely in opposition, and there are commonalities between both, but I think that there are contrasts that are interesting to raise. And indeed, both parasitism and commensality shape the partners' bodies and subjectivities in the process. So there are companions in a way, but I think that the way in which they shape each other's body differ from in each case. But if he is a biologist, I'm very.
Now I have difficulties to hear you.
Biological concept in its own, but I'm very much wanting to know more about it.
Okay. Are there any more questions or comments? If not, I have a sort of comment, or yeah. You used the term companionship to refer to these different sort of potato-human relationships. And the way I understand it, there is a very strong sort of ethical notion in that, right, of mutual care and so on. But as I was listening to your stories, there was a lot of sort of, political economic consideration and needs and pragmatism in there as well. And so I was wondering to what extent you think that this term encapsulates and accounts for these things as well.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and I think it points to a dimension of the companionship notion that I found very, very powerful, and it's the mix of care and instrumentalism under the companionship category. And this is something Harvey insists on. And in her ethical conception, inherited from the Greek philosophy,
You are muted, or, yeah. Olivia seems to be frozen. No, not yet.
Oh dear.
Yeah, that's sad. Just at the end.
Should we maybe give her a minute to come back, and then?
Yeah, just.
If not, we can just wrap up anyway. Hold on.
Oh, she's completely gone.
Oh no. Oh wait, here's Olivia. Here's Olivia.
Oh yeah.
Can you unmute, Olivia? Oops.
Olivia, you need to unmute. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm back. It's my home connection that's sometimes get lost. So I'm sorry. So I was saying that indeed the very notion of companionship is intended to bring together a notion of care and instrumentality, and show that organism and entities that we use or that we need, that we sometimes even ingest, nonetheless deserve to be treated with care and respect. And I think that's what Harry tried to argue with her example of the Inca mouse. And she never said that we could not use that mouse because she was saving human life, and she wasn't like strictly and universally against that fact, but she wanted to raise our attention to the fact that if we are going to use it in that extremely violent way, we need to care for the mouse and offer forms of living and dying that are respectful and considerable nonetheless. So it's a part that I really enjoy in the concept of companionship, is this capacity to bring together instrumentalism and use with care, and which I think resonate a lot with the relationship Andean peasants have with potatoes, because they love potatoes so much and they respect potatoes so much, and they eat it every day. And eating is violent, and no peasant would say that boiling a potato or eating a potato is not violent. They accept it, but they want to be careful to the potato in spite of eating it and because they eat it as well. And yeah, I think this is a very interesting stance that is difficult sometimes for us to adapt in our own kitchen in Europe.
Okay, if there are no further questions or comments, then I would like to thank you, Olivia, for this fascinating talk and deep insights into potatoes. And I would like to announce our next presentation on the 19th of May. Indigenous peoples and their role as bearers of hope in the Anthropocene, critical reflections from Indonesian Borneo, which will be given by Michaela Haupt from Cologne University. And we hope to see many of you then again.
Thank you so much for the meeting. It's been very enjoyable for me as well, and I've learned a lot from your questions. So thank you everyone for listening and give me comment back. We will be meeting soon.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. It was so interesting.
Bye.